April 1945, Okinawa. The rain fell in sheets across the coral ridges of Okinawa, turning the volcanic soil into rivers of red mud that swallowed boots and hope alike. In a limestone cave on the southern edge of the island, 17 Japanese women huddled in darkness, so complete they could no longer distinguish their own hands from the stone walls pressing against their shoulders. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, unwashed bodies, and something else, fear, metallic and sharp, clinging to the roof of the mouth like blood. Outside, the thunder of American artillery rolled across the landscape in waves, each concussion sending dust cascading from the cave ceiling. The women did not speak. They had not spoken in 3 days, not since the Imperial Army officer had distributed the grenades, 2 per group, and told them what was expected, what was honorable, what the Americans would do to them if they were captured alive. One woman, a nurse named Kimiko Hayashi, clutched a wooden comb in her pocket. It was the only possession she had carried through the entire campaign, a gift from her mother in Hiroshima. The comb's teeth were broken now. Half of them snapped off during the chaos of the American bombardment, but she held it anyway, pressing the jagged edges into her palm until they drew pinpricks of blood. The pain was clarifying. It reminded her that she was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than the gnawing emptiness that had settled into her chest like a stone. The imperial propaganda had been explicit. American soldiers were demons in human form, barbarians who would rape, torture, and mutilate any Japanese woman unfortunate enough to fall into their hands. The women had heard the stories, whispered in field hospitals and civilian shelters, stories that grew more horrific with each retelling. They had seen the leaflets dropped by Japanese command, crude illustrations depicting American soldiers committing unspeakable acts. They had been told, again and again, that death was preferable to capture, that suicide was not cowardice but the highest form of loyalty to the emperor and to their own dignity as Japanese women. Kimiko's fingers tightened around the comb. She could hear movement outside the cave now, closer than before, boots crunching on gravel, English voices, sharp and incomprehensible, the sound of metal scraping against rock. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the moment when everything they had been taught would be tested. To understand the terror that gripped those women in that Okinawan cave, one must first understand the machinery of ideology that had shaped their entire worldview. The Japanese militarist government, in its desperate campaign to prepare the civilian population for the inevitable American invasion of the home islands, had constructed an edifice of propaganda so complete, so totalizing, that it left no room for alternative interpretation. The Americans were not merely enemies. They were existential threats to the very concept of Japanese identity, honor, and civilization itself. The origins of this propaganda campaign can be traced to the earliest days of the Pacific War. When Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia in the winter of 1941 and spring of 1942, the victories came so swiftly, so completely, that they seemed to validate every claim of Japanese racial and spiritual superiority. The Americans, caught flat-footed at Pearl Harbor, retreating in chaos from the Philippines, surrendering in humiliation at Singapore. These Americans were weak, decadent, corrupted by their mongrel democracy and their worship of material comfort. This was the message hammered home in every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every school lesson. But as the war ground on and the tide began to turn, the propaganda evolved. It grew darker, more desperate. After the fall of Saipan in July 1944, when hundreds of Japanese civilians threw themselves from cliffs rather than surrender to American forces, the Japanese government seized upon these suicides as proof of national virtue. They were not tragedies but triumphs, evidence that the Japanese spirit remained unbreakable even in the face of overwhelming material superiority. The women who leaped to their deaths clutching their children, the men who detonated grenades against their own chests, these were not victims but heroes, models of the self-sacrifice that would be required of all Japanese citizens in the coming battles. For Japanese women, the propaganda was particularly insidious. Traditional Japanese society had long placed women in subordinate positions, their value measured primarily through their roles as mothers and wives, as vessels for the continuation of the family line and the preservation of Japanese bloodlines. The prospect of sexual violation by foreign soldiers, and American soldiers in particular, who were portrayed as barely civilized brutes, represented not merely a physical assault but a spiritual contamination that would make a woman's very existence intolerable. Death, the propaganda insisted, was the only way to preserve one's purity, one's honor, one's fundamental humanity. The military nurses who served alongside Japanese forces in the Pacific occupied an especially complex position. They were simultaneously elevated and endangered by their service. On one hand, they were celebrated as paragons of feminine virtue, selflessly tending to wounded soldiers, embodying the spirit of Japanese womanhood in its most noble form. On the other hand, they were acutely aware of their vulnerability. They had seen what happened to women in territories that changed hands. They had heard the stories, some true, many exaggerated or fabricated, of atrocities committed by both sides. They knew, with a certainty that required no evidence, what awaited them if they fell into enemy hands. By April 1945, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Okinawa, this propaganda apparatus had achieved a kind of perfect saturation. There was no counter-narrative, no alternative source of information. The women hiding in that cave had been marinated in these messages for years. They had no reason to doubt them and every reason to believe them. The evidence, as they understood it, was overwhelming. The Americans had firebombed Tokyo. They had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. They had demonstrated, repeatedly, their willingness to employ overwhelming violence against Japanese cities, Japanese soldiers, and Japanese civilians alike. Why would they show any mercy to Japanese women? The Battle of Okinawa, which had begun on April 1, 1945, was unlike any previous engagement in the Pacific War. It was not merely a battle for a strategic island or a key port. It was a preview of what the invasion of mainland Japan would look like, a grinding, brutal campaign in which the Japanese military had resolved to fight for every inch of ground, to inflict maximum casualties on American forces regardless of the cost to Japanese military personnel or civilians. The island's strategic importance was secondary to its symbolic value. Okinawa would demonstrate Japanese resolve. It would convince the Americans that the price of continuing the war was too high. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army, had more than 100,000 troops under his command, supplemented by thousands of Okinawan conscripts, including schoolboys as young as 14 and schoolgirls organized into nursing units. Ushijima's strategy was one of attrition. Rather than contesting the American landings on the beaches, he would allow American forces to come ashore unopposed, then bleed them white in a campaign of cave warfare, underground fortifications, and suicide attacks that would stretch on for months. The civilian population of Okinawa, numbering more than 300,000, was caught in the middle. Many had been forcibly relocated to the southern part of the island, where Japanese forces had concentrated their defenses. Others had been pressed into service, digging fortifications, carrying supplies, or serving as human shields. The Japanese military had made clear that civilians who surrendered to American forces would be treated as traitors. Families were instructed to commit mass suicide rather than allow themselves to be captured. Grenades were distributed to civilian groups for precisely this purpose. For the Japanese military nurses, the situation was even more dire. They were not merely civilians, they were part of the military apparatus, subject to military discipline and military expectations. Many of these women were members of the Haimyuri Student Corps, a unit composed primarily of female students from Okinawan high schools and teacher training colleges. They had been mobilized in the spring of 1945 to serve as nurses in the underground field hospitals established in caves throughout southern Okinawa. The conditions in these caves were hellish. Wounded soldiers lay on bare rock, often without anesthesia, their wounds festering in the humid darkness. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. The nurses worked by candlelight when they had candles, by touch when they did not. They amputated limbs with rusty saws. They held down screaming men as maggots were picked from their wounds. They watched, helpless, as soldiers died of gangrene, dysentery, and blood loss. And through it all, they were told that capture was worse than death. By late April, as American forces pushed deeper into the island's southern defenses, the underground hospitals became death traps. American forces, encountering fierce resistance from caves and fortified positions, began using flamethrowers and explosives to clear them. The nurses, ordered to remain at their posts, found themselves trapped between the advancing Americans and the collapsing Japanese defensive lines. Many were killed in the fighting. Others committed suicide as instructed. A small number, a very small number, found themselves in situations like the one Kimiko Hayashi faced, huddled in a cave, cut off from Japanese forces, surrounded by American troops, with nowhere left to run. The choice, as they understood it, was binary: die with honor or suffer unimaginable horrors. The American soldiers who approached that cave in April 1945 were not the monsters of Japanese propaganda, but they were not angels either. They were exhausted, traumatized young men, many of them teenagers, who had been fighting on Okinawa for weeks. They had seen their friends blown apart by artillery. They had watched kamikaze pilots crash into ships. They had cleared cave after cave, never knowing if the next one contained armed soldiers or terrified civilians, whether the figure emerging from the darkness held a weapon or a child. The Battle of Okinawa had already produced horrors on a scale that defied comprehension. American casualties would eventually exceed 50,000, including more than 12,000 dead. Japanese military deaths would approach 100,000. And the civilian toll, the Okinawan civilians caught between two armies, two ideologies, two visions of how the war should end, would be staggering. Estimates vary, but between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle, many of them in mass suicides orchestrated by Japanese military officers, who convinced them that death was preferable to American occupation. The American military was aware, at least in broad terms, of the propaganda that Japanese civilians had been fed. Intelligence officers had recovered Japanese leaflets and translated captured documents. They knew that Japanese soldiers and civilians had been told to expect torture, rape, and execution if they surrendered. And they knew that this propaganda was effective, that many Japanese soldiers would fight to the death rather than surrender, and that many civilians would kill themselves rather than be captured. The American response to this knowledge was inconsistent and depended heavily on the individual units involved and the specific circumstances of each encounter. There were, undeniably, instances of American soldiers committing atrocities against Japanese prisoners and civilians. War crimes occurred on both sides, though they were neither systematic nor officially sanctioned by American command. But there were also, increasingly as the battle wore on, conscious efforts by American forces to counter Japanese propaganda, to demonstrate that surrender did not mean death, that civilians would be treated humanely, that the nightmare scenarios described in Japanese leaflets were fiction. This effort was driven partly by humanitarian concerns and partly by cold military logic. Every Japanese soldier who surrendered was one fewer enemy combatant who had to be killed. Every civilian who came out of hiding was one fewer person who might be armed, one fewer potential casualty. The longer the battle dragged on, The more American commanders realized that they were not merely fighting the Japanese military, but fighting an ideology that had convinced an entire population that death was preferable to coexistence with Americans. Breaking that ideology required more than bullets. It required proof. When the American soldiers finally called into the cave in broken Japanese, "Come out, you will not be harmed," Kimiko Hayashi did not believe them. How could she? Everything in her experience, everything she had been taught, contradicted those words. The Americans were liars. They would say anything to lure Japanese soldiers and civilians into the open, where they could be more easily killed or captured for torture. But she also knew, with a clarity born of exhaustion and desperation, that staying in the cave meant certain death. The grenades they had been given were meant for exactly this situation. 2 grenades, 17 women. The mathematics of it was grotesque, but the conclusion was clear. They were supposed to cluster together, pull the pins simultaneously, and embrace death as their final act of loyalty to the emperor. Some of the women had already made peace with this outcome. They sat with their eyes closed, murmuring prayers to ancestors and gods, preparing their spirits for the transition. Others wept silently, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. A few simply stared into the darkness, their expressions blank, as if they had already vacated their bodies and left only empty shells behind. Kimiko looked at the comb in her hand. She thought about her mother, who had pressed it into her palm on the day she left for nursing school, who had told her to always keep herself presentable, to remember that she represented not just herself but her entire family. She thought about the soldiers she had tried to save, the ones who had died anyway. Their last words often calls for their mothers, for home, for an end to the pain. She thought about the propaganda officer who had distributed the grenades, his face smooth and certain, utterly convinced of the righteousness of what he was asking them to do. And then she thought about the American voice outside the cave, the one calling to them in broken Japanese. There was something in that voice that didn't match the propaganda. It sounded tired. It sounded human. She stood up, her legs shaking so badly she had to brace herself against the cave wall. The other women looked at her with expressions ranging from horror to pity. One of them, a girl no older than 16, reached out and grabbed Kimiko's wrist. "Don't," the girl whispered. "They'll do terrible things to you." Kimiko met her eyes. "We're going to die in here if we stay," she said quietly. "That's certain. What happens if we go out, that's uncertain. I choose uncertain." It was not bravery that made her take those first steps toward the mouth of the cave. It was not courage. It was simply the calculus of desperation, the recognition that there was no good choice, only a choice between certain death and possible death, between ending her own life and allowing someone else to make that decision for her. She walked toward the light. The first thing that struck Kimiko when she emerged from the cave was not the soldiers pointing weapons at her, though she registered them peripherally, their rifles trained on her chest. It was the smell. After days in the cave's stale, fetid air, the outside world smelled overwhelmingly alive. Wet earth, crushed vegetation, the metallic tang of cordite, and something else, something she couldn't immediately identify. Food. Cooked food. The Americans were cooking food within sight of the battlefield, as if they had an inexhaustible supply, as if the war were an inconvenience rather than an existential struggle. The American soldiers were shouting at her, but she couldn't understand the words. They gestured for her to raise her hands, which she did, slowly, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of bullets. Instead, one of the soldiers, a young man with red hair and freckles who looked barely older than some of her patients, approached her cautiously. He patted her down for weapons, his movements quick and professional but not violent. When he found none, he called something back to the others and then gestured for her to move to the side, away from the cave entrance. Behind her she could hear commotion. The other women were emerging, one by one, some of them sobbing, others silent and rigid with fear. The Americans separated them into a group, and then, to Kimiko's utter bewilderment, one of the soldiers pulled out a canteen and offered it to her. She stared at it for a long moment, her mind struggling to process this action. Was it poisoned? Was this some elaborate cruelty to offer water and then snatch it away? The soldier seemed to sense her hesitation. He took a drink from the canteen himself, then offered it again. Kimiko's thirst overcame her fear. She took the canteen with trembling hands and drank. The water was slightly metallic, tinged with the taste of the canteen's metal interior, but it was cold and clean, and it was the most wonderful thing she had tasted in days. She drank until the soldier gently took the canteen back and passed it to the next woman. What followed was not torture. It was not rape. It was not any of the horrors that Kimiko had been prepared for. Instead, the American soldiers, with a mixture of efficiency and visible discomfort, organized the women into a column and marched them away from the front lines, toward the rear areas where American medical facilities had been established. The walk took less than an hour, but for Kimiko, it felt like crossing into another world. As they moved through the American-controlled territory, she saw things that contradicted every assumption she had held about the enemy. She saw American medics treating wounded Japanese soldiers alongside their own wounded, using the same supplies, the same careful attention. She saw stockpiles of food and medical equipment that dwarfed anything she had seen in Japanese facilities. She saw American soldiers sitting in the shade, eating from tin cans, laughing at some private joke, displaying a casualness about the war that seemed almost sacrilegious. And then she saw the camp. The American prisoner of war facilities on Okinawa were improvised affairs, hastily constructed from tents and salvaged materials, designed to process the growing number of Japanese soldiers and civilians who were surrendering or being captured as the battle progressed. By late April 1945, the Americans were taking in hundreds of prisoners daily, a logistical challenge that strained their resources, but one they were determined to meet according to the standards established by the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions, international agreements governing the treatment of prisoners of war, were not universally applied during World War II. Japan had not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention and did not consider itself bound by its provisions. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners of war was notoriously brutal, resulting in death rates that sometimes exceeded 50% in camps in the Philippines, Thailand, and Japan itself. American, British, and Australian prisoners were subjected to forced labor, starvation, torture, and summary execution. But the United States had ratified the Geneva Conventions and, at least in theory, was committed to treating prisoners according to their provisions. In practice, this commitment was tested repeatedly in the Pacific War, where racial animosity, desire for revenge, and the sheer difficulty of securing prisoners in combat conditions led to numerous violations. Japanese soldiers who attempted to surrender were sometimes shot, either because American troops did not trust the sincerity of the surrender, or because taking prisoners in the midst of combat was tactically dangerous. Wounded Japanese soldiers who appeared dead would sometimes detonate grenades when American troops approached, reinforcing the perception that any Japanese soldier, regardless of apparent condition, was a potential threat. But by 1945, American military leadership had recognized that the systematic killing of prisoners was both morally indefensible and strategically counterproductive. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, had issued explicit orders that prisoners were to be treated humanely and that violations would be prosecuted. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding American forces on Okinawa, had reiterated these orders and established specific protocols for handling Japanese prisoners, particularly civilians and women. These protocols were designed, in part, to counter Japanese propaganda. American intelligence officers understood that every prisoner who was treated well became potential evidence that Japanese civilians and soldiers had been lied to. If word spread that surrender did not mean death, that American treatment of prisoners was humane, then more Japanese would surrender, reducing American casualties and shortening the war. It was cold logic, but it aligned with humanitarian principles in a way that made implementation easier. When Kimiko and the other women arrived at the processing camp, they were directed to a separate section reserved for female prisoners. Here, for the first time, Kimiko encountered American military nurses, women in uniform who looked at her not with hatred or lust, but with something that looked almost like sympathy. One of these nurses, a woman with dark hair and a face weathered by months in the Pacific Theater, approached Kimiko and spoke to her through a Japanese-American interpreter. The nurse's words, translated into Japanese, were simple and direct. "You are safe now. We are going to examine you to make sure you are not injured, and then we are going to get you cleaned up and fed. No one is going to hurt you." Kimiko did not believe her. She could not believe her. The gap between this statement and everything she had been taught was too vast to bridge in a single moment. She stood rigid as the nurse conducted a brief medical examination, checking for wounds, signs of disease, obvious malnutrition. The nurse's touch was professional, impersonal but not rough. When she finished, she made a note on a clipboard and said something to another nurse, who nodded and gestured for Kimiko to follow her. They walked to a tent that had been set up with several large basins filled with water. Steam rose from the basins. Hot water. They had hot water. The nurse handed Kimiko a bar of soap and a towel, and through the interpreter explained that she should wash herself. Kimiko stared at the soap, at the towel, at the basin of hot water. She looked at the nurse, searching for the trap, the moment when the kindness would be revealed as cruelty. The nurse simply waited, her expression patient. Slowly, Kimiko began to undress. Her uniform was filthy, stiff with dried mud and sweat and blood. She peeled it off piece by piece, acutely aware of her own smell, her own filth. The other women were doing the same, some of them crying quietly as they removed clothing they had worn for weeks without washing. When Kimiko stepped into the basin and felt the hot water against her skin, something inside her broke. She had not cried when the artillery fell. She had not cried when she watched soldiers die. She had not cried when she was handed a grenade and told to kill herself. But now, feeling clean water washing away layers of dirt and fear, she wept. The American nurses did not interfere. They simply stood nearby, offering more soap when needed, providing clean clothing, simple cotton dresses that had been requisitioned from supply depots, and giving the women privacy to wash and dress themselves. This was not what Kimiko had expected. This was not torture or degradation. This was kindness, methodical and bureaucratic perhaps, but undeniably kindness. The symbolic power of that bath, of that simple act of washing, cannot be overstated. In Japanese culture, cleanliness and ritual bathing hold profound significance. The bath is not merely hygienic. It is restorative, purifying, almost sacred. To be clean is to be human, to be dignified, to be worthy of respect. The filth that Kimiko and the other women had accumulated was not just physical. It was a manifestation of their degradation, their reduction to something less than human during the battle. They had been living like animals in caves, covered in mud and blood and waste. The Americans, by offering them the means to clean themselves, by providing hot water and soap and privacy, were restoring their humanity. And they were doing it immediately, before interrogation, before processing, before anything else. The message, though the Americans may not have fully understood its cultural weight, was clear. You are human. You have worth. You will be treated as human. For women who had been prepared for rape, for torture, for death, this reversal was psychologically devastating in its own way. The entire framework through which they understood the world, the framework that had been constructed by years of propaganda, by military indoctrination, by cultural assumptions about foreign barbarism, was collapsing. If the Americans were not monsters, if they were capable of this small kindness, then what else had been a lie? Kimiko sat in her clean dress, her damp hair combed out with a comb provided by the American nurses. She still had her mother's broken comb, clutched in her hand, but she used the American one for practical purposes and tried to understand what was happening to her. Around her, the other women sat in similar states of confusion and shock. Some of them were eating rice balls and canned fruit that the Americans had provided, though they ate mechanically, as if the act of eating were simply something their bodies were doing without conscious involvement. The camp itself was a revelation. Kimiko watched American soldiers moving about their duties with a casualness that bordered on indifference. They did not seem particularly interested in the Japanese prisoners except as logistical problems to be managed. There was no gloating, no cruelty, no display of dominance. If anything, many of the American soldiers seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation, avoiding eye contact with the prisoners, hurrying through their assigned tasks so they could return to their own areas of the camp. The abundance of the American camp was staggering. Kimiko had known, intellectually, that America was wealthy, that it had industrial capacity far exceeding Japan's. But knowing something intellectually and witnessing it viscerally are different things. The Americans had enough food that they threw some of it away. She saw soldiers scraping half-eaten meals into trash barrels, food that would have been precious in the Japanese camps, food that soldiers had died fighting over. The Americans had trucks that moved constantly, bringing supplies from ships to the front lines and back again. They had radios that seemed to work reliably. They had medical supplies in quantities that made the shortages in Japanese field hospitals seem even more criminal. And they had chocolate. An American soldier, walking past the area where the female prisoners were being held, tossed a candy bar over the fence. It landed in the dirt near Kimiko's feet. She stared at it for a long moment, wondering if it was poisoned, if this was some cruel experiment. But then one of the other women picked it up, unwrapped it, and took a cautious bite. Her eyes widened. She took another bite, then another, and then she began to cry again, but this time the tears seemed almost like relief. The soldier who had thrown the chocolate was already gone, probably didn't even remember doing it. It was a casual gesture, meaningless to him, the kind of thing American soldiers did throughout the Pacific, sharing their rations with children, with civilians, with prisoners, because they had so much that giving some away cost them nothing. But for the Japanese women, that chocolate bar was a symbol of something larger. It represented abundance so complete that it could be given away without thought. It represented a society wealthy enough that its soldiers carried luxury goods into combat. It represented a worldview so fundamentally different from their own that it defied comprehension. How do you fight people who throw away food? How do you defeat an enemy that has enough of everything that they can afford to be generous to prisoners? How do you maintain belief in your own superiority when confronted with such overwhelming material evidence of your own poverty? Over the following days, as Kimiko and the other women were processed through the American prisoner of war system, the contradictions continued to mount. They were photographed, fingerprinted, interviewed by intelligence officers through interpreters. They were asked about military installations, troop movements, command structures, but they were not tortured for this information. When they didn't know answers or refused to answer, the interrogators simply moved on to the next question. There was no violence, no threats, just a methodical working through a checklist of intelligence priorities. They were housed in tents that, while not comfortable, were clean and dry. They were given blankets, clothing, basic toiletries. They were fed 3 times a day, food that was often better than what they had eaten even before the war, certainly better than anything they had seen during their time in the caves. The American military's standard prisoner ration exceeded the Japanese military's standard soldier ration in both quantity and quality. And they were given access to medical care. Kimiko, trained as a nurse, was astounded by the American field hospitals. The equipment, the supplies, the sheer abundance of resources devoted to saving lives. It was like nothing she had experienced. American medics used penicillin, the miracle drug that Japan had never managed to mass produce, to treat infections that would have been death sentences in Japanese facilities. They had blood plasma for transfusions. They had sterile instruments, proper anesthesia, X-ray machines. One of the American doctors, learning that Kimiko was a trained nurse, asked her through an interpreter if she would be willing to assist in the hospital. He was not ordering her. He was asking. The request itself was surreal. Why would they trust a Japanese prisoner to work in their medical facilities? What if she sabotaged equipment or poisoned patients? But the doctor seemed genuinely unconcerned about these possibilities. He needed help, and she had medical training, and that was apparently sufficient. Kimiko agreed, partly because she wanted something to do, partly because she was curious, and partly because nursing was the one thing that still made sense to her in a world that had stopped making sense. Working in the American hospital, Kimiko saw Japanese wounded being treated alongside American wounded. She saw American doctors and nurses working to save Japanese soldiers who, hours earlier, had been trying to kill Americans. She saw amputations performed on Japanese prisoners with the same care and use of anesthesia that was provided to American soldiers. She heard American medics complaining about shortages of supplies, not because they didn't have enough to treat their own wounded, but because they didn't have enough to treat everyone, Allied and Japanese alike, to the standard they wanted to maintain. This was not the behavior of demons. This was not the behavior of barbarians. This was the behavior of people who believed that human life had intrinsic value, regardless of nationality, regardless of the uniform someone wore. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything Kimiko had been taught, everything she had believed about the Americans, was being systematically dismantled by the simple reality of decent treatment. And she was not alone in this experience. The other women, the other prisoners, were going through similar processes of realization and adjustment. They talked among themselves in quiet voices, trying to make sense of what was happening to them. Some clung to their old beliefs, insisting that this kindness was temporary, that the real horrors would come later. Others began to tentatively accept that perhaps, they had been lied to. The American military's treatment of Japanese prisoners on Okinawa was not uniformly excellent. There were failures, mistakes, instances of abuse. Some American soldiers did commit atrocities. Some prisoners were mistreated. The system was implemented by human beings under extreme stress, and it was imperfect. But the overall pattern, the general policy, was one of attempting to provide humane treatment according to international standards. And this pattern was driven by a mixture of principle, pragmatism, and propaganda. The principle was simple: prisoners of war should be treated humanely because that is what civilized nations do. This principle was embedded in American military culture, taught in training, enforced through command structure. Violations were, at least theoretically, subject to punishment. The pragmatism was equally straightforward. Well-treated prisoners provided better intelligence, and the perception that surrender would not result in torture or death encouraged more surrenders, which saved American lives. The propaganda value was perhaps most important in the long term. The United States was not merely fighting to defeat Japan militarily. It was fighting to demonstrate that the American system, democracy, capitalism, individual rights, was superior to Japanese militarism. Every prisoner who was treated well, who was fed and clothed and housed adequately, who was allowed to write letters home, who was eventually repatriated alive and intact, was evidence of this superiority. The Americans understood that the war would end eventually, and that the post-war occupation of Japan would be far easier if the Japanese population had some reason to believe that American intentions were not simply destructive. But for the Japanese women in that camp, these abstract strategic considerations meant nothing. What mattered was the concrete reality of their treatment. What mattered was the hot water, the soap, the food, the medical care, the simple human decency of American soldiers who treated them as human beings rather than as enemies to be destroyed or objects to be abused. And what mattered, most of all, was the slow, painful realization that they had been prepared to die for a lie. The Battle of Okinawa officially ended on June 22, 1945, though sporadic fighting continued for weeks afterward. The final death toll was catastrophic: more than 12,000 American dead, more than 100,000 Japanese military dead, and between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilian dead. The island was transformed into a moonscape of craters and ruins. Its ancient castles were destroyed. Its forests were stripped bare. Its civilian population was decimated. Kimiko Hayashi survived. She spent the remainder of the war in American custody, working as a nurse in the POW hospital, treating both Japanese and American patients. She watched the transformation of other prisoners, the slow process by which men and women who had been indoctrinated to hate and fear Americans began to accept that their former enemies were simply people, capable of cruelty but also capable of kindness, driven by the same basic desires for food, safety, home. She was in the camp when news came of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima, where her mother lived. She would not learn her mother's fate until months later, after the war ended, after she was repatriated to Japan. Her mother had survived barely, with burns and radiation sickness that would eventually kill her. The comb her mother had given her, the one Kimiko had carried through the entire war, was one of the few possessions from before the war that survived. Kimiko was also in the camp when Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The announcement was met with disbelief by many prisoners, with relief by others, with despair by some who felt that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Kimiko felt primarily numbness. The war was over. She had survived. These facts seemed almost meaningless in the face of everything she had lost, everything that had been destroyed. The process of repatriation took months. American forces had to organize the return of hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians scattered across the Pacific. Kimiko returned to Japan in late 1945, traveling on an American ship that was crowded with other repatriates, all of them struggling to understand what they would find when they returned home. What they found was a Japan that had been shattered, cities reduced to rubble, industries destroyed, millions dead or homeless. The emperor, once presented as a living god, reduced to a constitutional figurehead forced to announce his own humanity in a radio address. The entire ideological structure that had governed Japanese society for decades was collapsing, and into the vacuum came American occupation forces, bringing with them new ideas about democracy, individual rights, women's equality. For many Japanese, particularly those who had been most invested in the militarist ideology, this transformation was humiliating and traumatic. But for others, including some who had been prisoners of war, who had experienced firsthand the contrast between Japanese propaganda and American reality, the occupation represented an opportunity. These individuals had seen that an alternative existed, that the American model, for all its flaws, offered freedoms and material abundance that the Japanese militarist system had never provided. Kimiko did not become an uncritical admirer of America. She had seen too much, suffered too much, lost too much for that. But she did become someone who,